Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Kim Davis, and I am I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, but I'm an independent researcher, and my company name is Top Performance Leadership Group, LLC. And what I do, I actually am an expert in human performance improvement. And many times I apply that to organizational development or organizational behavior, but I also apply it in school systems with our students. So this particular paper addresses a need in our school system because of the overt behaviors that we're seeing that are very extreme and very different than what we had seen pre-pandemic. So what I would like to do is talk a little bit about an ethological approach to managing student behavior in the classrooms. Before I get too far into that, though, let me talk just a minute about how we actually got here. After the pandemic, you'll hear education or educators worldwide talk about the COVID slide or COVID learning loss. Students went home in 2020, March of 2020, and didn't come back to school for a year and a half, almost 2 school years. And during that time, there was learning at home, but they did not have the interaction and social support that they get in a school system. And they did not learn as deeply, and they did not retain what they were learning as much. So there's a big gap in what they knew when they left and what they know now and how they learn. And there's reasons for that. During this separation, during the isolation of the pandemic, the students were not exposed to the social fabric of our society. And what happens then is they start to have changes in their brain development, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But really what we were seeing is deficits in self-regulation, their resiliency and ability to manage their situation or cope with the situation that they're in, and their inability or lessened ability for academic achievements. So that was compounded with teacher shortages. A lot of teachers did not come back to work after the pandemic. There's been a lot of talk and research on the pay that they receive because they are college educated, but they don't receive the same pay scale or rates as other college degree required professions. And just the extreme behaviors that they're having to deal with right now is just not something they feel safe with. But the pandemic has shaped the behaviors quite a bit. And when I talk about shaping behaviors, behavior changes in succession, and we don't actually truly change behavior. What we do is we replace it with new behavior. And so when I talk about an ethological approach to behavior, we're looking at a biological behavior approach, because when we learn, we rewire the brain. We use different neural pathways at that time. So anytime we're exposed to something different in the environment or contact with some sort of a consequence, our brain rewires itself. And so as we're looking at the student behavior, we have to think about how the brain has been rewired during the pandemic and the things that happened during that shutdown time, and why we have to work differently with the children in our school systems. So as I talk about an ethological approach, the biological and behavioral approach to looking at how humans interact and build the social fabric of our societies, the first thing I want to just kind of mention that kind of helps shape this theory is mirror neurons. If you've ever been around somebody else and they were laughing and you started laughing, or you saw someone cry and you cried, or let somebody yawn and try not to yawn next to them, those are mirror neurons. When you see that happening, you do the same thing. Your mind mirrors theirs and you experience the same thing. And that's a survival thing, because if you were, in a different situation and somebody was afraid and running, if you did not also feel fear and run, then you may not survive. If they were happy and joyful, you wouldn't know to go that direction to be happy and joyful also. So mirror neurons are actually very important in social development and survival. We also, I have the bullet point of I do, we do, you do. We also have the ability to differentiate or discriminate the things that we see. And there's been some research on, like when we teach our children to do things, we model it for them, we do it for them, and let them watch us, and then they also do it. But we might ask them to do something different. We might pick up a toy and ask them to place it in, and they're going to help us pick up a different toy, and we ask them to put it in the toy box. The child has to know whether or not, they have to differentiate whether or not they're supposed to pick up the toy and play with it, pick up the toy, or put it in the box. So they learn to differentiate and discriminate. That's our learning process, but we see that, we learn through the model that happened. But there's also been research that talks about, we hear a lot about gratitude, and there's research about happiness. Sean Acker is one of my favorite researchers on this topic. He's from Harvard University, and he actually coined the term happiness advantage. And in his research, he's identified that through brain scan, functional MRIs and brain scans, that a positive brain actually has biological advantages over a neutral or a sad or negative thinking brain. One of the things that I do want to mention here also is there's another researcher named Epstein Seymour who actually did research on constructive and destructive thinking. And what we talk about a lot of times is that when we're having positive thoughts, it's a learned ability. When we are hardwired as human beings for safety and survival to have deficit thinking. So if we see something red, we automatically think blood, we could get hurt, we run from it. If we are trying to make meaning out of things, and we are meaning-making creatures, if you look at the sky, at the clouds, you don't see clouds, you see images of teddy bears or puppy dogs and things like that. Our mind has to make meaning. So when we are, if we don't have a whole story, we hear something, but we don't know all of it, then we tend to make up a story to fill in the holes. But our natural inclination, the way that we are hardwired as human beings, is to have a deficit thought, like it could go wrong. And if it can go wrong, what would that be? And that's a survival mechanism. So when we start to have positive thoughts or try to learn to have positive thoughts, it is a learned ability to think constructively or to think positively. What I really liked about Sean Acker's work, though, is that he identifies that two things that were very important to what we're talking about today. One, you cannot have a positive and a negative thought at the same time. In applied behavior, we actually talk about that as differential reinforcement of opposing behaviors. And how we think about things is a behavior. It's a verbal behavior, not overt, something that you can see, but it's very important in learning to be able to separate those two. And I'm going to talk about that, why that's important in just a minute. So we've started with the mirror neurons. We see things and we feel it or respond the same way. The I do, we do, you do is our ability to see somebody model behavior and be able to differentiate or discriminate between actions that should follow that. The happiness advantage, which actually tells us that our positive thoughts are more healthy and more adaptable for survival, and that we cannot have a happy and a sad thought at the same time. But also positive psychology and cognitive behavior therapy use these concepts and do what we call flipping and reframing. So we flip the script from a negative thought process to a positive one, and we reframe it into a positive statement, and so that we can start changing how we think about the things that we're thinking of in our mind. In my research, I've come up with an additional term called the paradigm fulcrum, that thing or that moment that moves us from thoughts to action. How do you take all this stuff that's going on in your mind? You see something, you respond the same way they do, but wait, you have to differentiate. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Or do I do something else based on what I've seen? And then training your mind to have a positive thought instead of a negative one, to stay in the happiness advantage, flip it and reframe it and start to the self-talk into something more positive. The paradigm fulcrum, the thing that moves us from thoughts to action then is, are we now acting wisely? So we're going to train our mind to think constructively and act wisely. So as we're thinking about the ethology of student behavior, anybody's behavior really, we have to remember that there is a biological foundation to what people do, how they do it, and why they do it. And if we are aligned in that with our interventions, then it's much easier for us to replace behavior that is maladaptive with behavior that is more socially acceptable and a benefit to the student themselves. So what does that mean in a school? All of this, what does all this neurology mean to our students? Well, there's a couple of things to really talk about with that. We talk about interventions in school, behavioral interventions, but the interventions generally look like a student being assigned a shadow. So the student's behavior is so disruptive in school that it's interfering with their learning and the learning of their peers. So they are assigned an adult shadow, and that person is supposed to help them learn to cope with their environment and also help them, wean them off of the need for the shadow so that they can be independent and self-evident in their learning environment. But what happens a lot of times, most of the time, is that person is really just kind of babysitting. They're just following them around in case something goes wrong. And they're not utilizing intervention. They're not teaching the child to be self-evident and independent. So that has to change. That's one of the ways we use interventions without intention. Another thing that I see a lot when I'm advising for schools is an out-of-school placement. When a student is placed either in an in-school suspension, so they're put in a timeout within the school, or out-of-school suspension where they're asked to go home for a few days, what they fail to do is create a re-entry plan that helps a student become more successful when they do come back. So basically they're removed from the situation because of the behavior, and then they're placed back in that situation without any support and how to change that behavior. The biggest problem that we see, the biggest issue that I consult with is the idea that we tell students to behave better, act better, act right, do what you're supposed to do. We tell them, but we don't really show them what to do. We don't teach them how to do that. And I'm going to actually back down for just a minute and talk about how we actually teach children to do things. If you think about it, from birth, when an infant is born, they cry. And when they cry, we feed them, we hold them, we change them, we help them fall asleep and put them down for bed, but we love them and nurture them because they cried. That's how they communicate with us. Over time, over the first few months, they start having different cries. We, as we are observing the behavior, the crying behavior, we begin to have the ability to differentiate and the type of cry. So, that cry means they're hungry. That cry means they're tired. This cry means they need to be changed. So we start learning that, and they start learning to make different sounds as well. What we're doing is we're shaping functional communication that has a function to meet a need. Well, we don't really spend a lot of time talking to parents or helping parents understand that when because they learn to have a tantrum and cry for the things that they needed for survival as an infant, if we don't give them the functional communication as they get older, then they enter the school systems also still doing those things, crying and having tantrums and throwing things and having maladaptive social behavior. But as they enter the school system, though, it's one of the things that I think is important to point out. When our children are growing, our infants are growing into toddlerhood and then childhood, we have height and weight charts, and we look to see are they meeting these milestones, and we always understand that every child develops at their own rate. And even within a household, one child may develop faster or slower than their sibling. And we accept that until they get until they start public schools. And then we expect everyone to be the same and behave the same way and be at the same developmental level, and they're just not. But if I'm going to ask somebody to write their name, my last name is Davis, it starts with the letter D. And when I learned to write my name, I first had to learn all my letters and sounds. And I had to learn the difference between an uppercase and a lowercase letter. And I had to learn to write the shape of that letter. And so there's a whole process that was scaffolded to help me learn to write my name, even to the point where someone may have held my hand while I held the pencil to help me feel the shape. And I drew on dotted lines, and then eventually the dotted lines were faded till I could write it by myself. This whole process to develop something as simple as writing my name. But we don't do that for behavior. If a student who doesn't have functional communication comes into the school system and they are not behaving in a socially acceptable way, we don't take the time to reshape that behavior into something more acceptable, even in small successions, the way that we're talking about with handwriting. What we do is we put them out. And so we're not teaching those social skills in social settings. The situation was exacerbated with the pandemic. We're very social creatures, and we rely on those mirror neurons to be able to develop completely, emotionally, psychologically, and cognitively. But we put masks over our faces. We socially distanced. We didn't see our family members. Many families lost family members and friends, and it was a very difficult time. Everyone was afraid to be around each other or be too close to each other. And it changed how we interacted with each other. That year and a half is a huge developmental time period. For some kids, it might have been half their lifetime. It might have been a third of their lifetime, but it was, unless they were adults, all of it was a significant time in their life to not have that social fabric constructed for them. There's another researcher that has come up with he's done through functional brain scans, functional MRIs, has been able to determine after about 82,000 brain scans that when we go through a trauma like the pandemic, our brains are rewired, and it's a trauma. And a trauma can be healed, just like you break your arm, you can heal it. It may not be exactly the same, but it can heal. But in their 82,000 brain scans, what they noticed is that 100% of the students who had maladaptive behavior had some sort of trauma in their life, whether it was psychological or physical. There was some sort of trauma that they experienced. So what I am proposing through my research is that we take that ethological perspective of shaping student behavior with the knowledge that we have on trauma and learning processes. And we have a tool, or we develop tools that help them make the connections that were not made during the pandemic. The example I'm going to give is a case study that I had used. I've had 14 students in a intervention program. This particular school that I was consulting had, all schools have academic interventions. For a period of the day, they will send students into specific rooms and they work on certain skills together, but they don't do it behaviorally, they only do it academically. So in this school, we set up a behavior intervention, just like the academic ones. And I, worked on this process. I'm gonna tell the story of one little girl. On this particular Monday morning, as she came in to the classroom, she was very upset. She was crying as she came in. She did not hang her backpack up. She threw it across the room. At the table, she didn't pull her chair out. She pulled it way too hard and it slid across the floor and fell over, and was having a very hard time, bringing herself back into being able to have any communication with me. And the overarching thing, without getting too detailed in this, is she lacked functional communication. When she got upset, when her emotions peaked, the brain did not, the synapses in the brain did not connect the way they were supposed to. They arced instead. So as a trauma response, and she would overreact. And in that fight or flight overreaction period, she was not very verbal, so she couldn't say what she was trying to say. And so she acted out. But behavior is communication. So I gave her some space and time. I asked the other students to go back to class. So I turned the lights down a little bit. So I reduced the stimulation going to her brain so it could be quiet and a little not quite as bright. And it took her a few minutes before she was able to speak to me, and I asked what happened. And it was to us, it's going to sound very simple, but to her, in her trauma damaged brain, it was very catastrophic for a third grader that her birthday had been the day before, and she did not get to go to the beach because it was raining. They went to an ice cream parlor instead, and she had ice cream. And when she got to school, somebody asked her, "How was your birthday?" And it triggered her. It triggered the memory of that. And this is one of the things on the happiness advantage that I didn't mention. When Sean Acker was doing his functional MRIs, he was able to demonstrate consistently that anytime you remember something, it activates the same parts of the brain and the same amount of the brain with a memory as it did with the actual experience. That's why if you tell a joke and you thought it was funny, you laugh while you tell it. Or if you tell a sad story, you cry when you tell it. So she was re-experiencing her feelings from not being able to go to the beach that she wanted to do for her birthday. So the tool that I use is a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper turned landscape, and one side is blank and the other has a picture frame that's blank in the middle and a couple of lines at the bottom. So I had the piece of paper and the pencil on the table waiting for her, and I asked her to draw me a picture of the beach with the rain. Now, I specifically asked for pencil and didn't ask any other questions of the experience. So she drew what it was going to be. And then I asked her what she did instead of going to the beach. And as she was talking, I picked up the pencil and put down crayons. And I asked her to draw the picture of the ice cream parlor inside the frame. So we're flipping and reframing. With that picture, we're using color. I'm asking questions and details all the way down to the sprinkles on the ice cream. And what was amazing to me, as we were reactivating the memory of eating ice cream and reinforcing it by engaging her and meeting one of the functions of behavior, and that's to gain attention, I was able to switch her mood. So she actually was able to de-escalate herself and act appropriately. But by bringing out all the detail and asking for the color, what I'm doing is I'm activating more parts of the brain and giving her an opportunity to create a stronger memory to the happiness and less emphasis on the part that made her upset. And so when we finished this process, I asked her to rewrite the sentence at the bottom. So now we're re-scripting her memory. And instead of saying, "It rained on my birthday, so I didn't get to go to the beach and I had to go eat ice cream," we reframed that to be, "It rained on my birthday, so I got to go eat ice cream." So now we flipped and reframed that memory from something negative to something positive, and we reinforced it with all the detail. And then we rewrote it so she would think and say it differently. So what we're doing is we're rewiring the brain. Well, I did take it a step further because I wanted to have an idea of whether, and it took 17 minutes. It only took 17 minutes for this to happen, for her to completely de-escalate and be in a great mood. In fact, she asked permission to go pick up her backpack, which I gave. She walked over, not ran or anything, out of the way. She walked directly to it, picked it up and hung it up. I gave her more attention by, reinforcing that behavior by praising it and how proud I was that she had asked permission before she got up and that she had picked up her backpack and put it up appropriately. So I decided to take it a step further because I thought 17 minutes was a pretty quick response for de-escalation, especially for this particular child. So I wrote down a couple of sentences, and I'm thinking back to Sean Acker's work about activating the same parts of the brain with the memory as the experience. And I knew that this was a happy time right now. She was in a really great mood, and eating the ice cream with her family was now a happy memory. So I wrote down 3 questions for the teacher. And the first one was a very minimal description or question, like what flavor ice cream did you have? Second one was more detail. And then the third But the idea was if she started to have difficulties with her behavior, I wanted her to ask one of the questions. And if that one didn't work, we would wait a few minutes and ask the next one. But the idea is that we wanted to trigger the memory that was happy. And I was very proud to say that during that day, one question had to be asked during a disagreement with another student over a resource in the classroom. And the teacher walked over and followed the practice I had given her and just called her by name and said, "Hey, I heard you got to eat ice cream on your birthday. What flavor was it?" And the child looked and gave her eye contact, which she did not normally do, smiled very quickly and said it was chocolate. And the teacher said, "I love chocolate too." Walked away, and this student in particular gave up the resource from the classroom and went about her day. Didn't have to be said anymore. That week was the first week that she passed her spelling test and did not go to the office anymore. I'm sure there's other contributing factors to the room and the environment that would help continue to trigger those happy memories, but it was such an effective tool on that child with such extreme behavior. I think that it's something that warrants further investigation. It's not a new concept, it just hasn't been used with children or in a school environment. And I think that in this post-pandemic time, it's something that we really need to spend time looking at more. It's very hard sometimes to get a functional behavior analysis done, especially in a real setting. And a lot of times we don't have time, but in an applied behavior analysis, the idea of that is that we get single case research, which one student at each individual is their own control, and you get more real-time data so that you can make decisions on the fly or right there in real time. So again, there's more research that's necessary, but it's a very positive indication. This method has worked with 14 different students in different situations, very intentionally. And I think that there's an opportunity here for us to start developing tools to help reshape the behavior of our students in our school system. What questions can I answer for you guys?